Hi, Alex.
Hi, Antonella.
So I'm super excited. Actually, our study, it almost feels a little bit like a joke, but it is for real that we're talking about bone density and prune.
We sure are.
Yep.
Or dried plums.
Dried
Dried
plums.
plums.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. I'm told they're being rebranded.
Yeah. Although it does say prunes in the study, but a lot of, I find anyway, you'll see prunes referred to as dried plums. The rebranding has begun.
Yeah, apparently. But I had shared with Alex earlier that I actually really love prunes. I find them such a treat and sometimes literally have to control myself to not overdo it. As we will see, 100 grams was a lot for people to take. I will reiterate that that seems true in my life as well. Yeah, but prunes or dried plums, excuse me, are quite delicious. But yeah, we're going to look at a study that looked at bone mineral density and osteoporosis in postmenopausal women. It's actually pretty cleanly done. I think you'd agree, Alex, that they did like a really good job on a lot of fronts. Yeah, so if you want to give us a summary of what we're looking at.
Yeah. So this was a study called the Prune study. So they didn't use the rebranded terminology. So the Prune study, published in 2022, actually, by the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And the study was titled Prunes Preserve Hip Bone Mineral Density in a 12-month randomized controlled trial in postmenopausal women, the Prune study. So yes, this was not the first study of prunes and bone density, but it is the most recent one. So we'll touch on the end that there have been a couple of secondary analyses of these study to like dig a little deeper. But this is the last study we directly have around prunes and bone density, but it was not the first, which is super interesting. And there's
Yeah.
reasons for that, right? So this particular study was trying to build on those prior studies. And so they took a group of people and split them into three groups. So there were just over 200 people split into three different groups: a control group who did not get prunes, a group that ate 50 grams of prunes, which is about 4 to 6 prunes on average, depending on the size, and then a group that ate 100 grams of prune, 100 grams of prunes, which would be 10 to 12 prunes, of
Mhm.
course. And so they were looked at they had to do this for 12 months. That was the plan. So that was a commitment, right?
Mhm.
So doing this for 12 months, and then their bone density, as well as some biomarkers, blood tests, and things like weight were measured over the course of that 12 months. Some things every 3 months, but most things at the 6 month mark. So like at baseline at 0 months, and then at 6 months, and at 12 months. I laughed because we'll talk about digestive consequences as we go. But in fact, for the prune groups, they did this run-in so that you didn't jump into doing 4 to 6 or 10 to 12 prunes all at once on day one. You actually had this run-in period of time where they started with one and they built up to the
Yeah.
total amount of prunes to give some time to adjust to the fiber content, among other things. So with these three groups: control 50 grams, 100 grams, ideally for a year, look to see if bone density was improved at the end of that time. So that was the general
Yeah, the design.
format,
Yeah.
the design of the
Mhm.
study. Yeah. Yep.
And why were prunes a candidate here, I think, in the first place? Because what's interesting is it's probably not their calcium content. And then we'll just add that the women in the study were calcium replete. So they made sure to like keep them up enough in their calcium. But there's something specific about the prunes that made them good candidates to study. And this is, I think, such a fascinating connection.
Yeah. And so not only were they replete in the calcium, so everyone was kind of on the same board there, I think they were also monitoring vitamin D. So
Mhm.
nutrients that are both considered important for good bone health. So they made sure that everyone was on the same page with that. And the difference, hopefully, was just in the prune content of the
Yes.
diet. So prunes are quite rich in a plant chemical or phytochemical called polyphenol, which is a wide category of chemicals that has become really of great interest in the nutrition and health field because polyphenols have, generally speaking, anti-inflammatory and antioxidant qualities. So we're starting to see lots of different health conditions seemingly respond quite well to polyphenol content, and dietary patterns that have more polyphenol
Mhm.
content seem to be associated with better health outcomes. So prunes happen to be among a myriad number of foods which are rich in polyphenols. That being said, prunes are amongst the highest of a particular type of polyphenol, or two versions of one polyphenol called chlorogenic acid. So there's chlorogenic acid and neochlorogenic acid. and prunes are basically, if you look at those two compounds collectively, the highest sources of those particular compounds, which I guess someone had to be. And it just turns out that those particular polyphenols seem to have qualities to them which help like preserve and prevent bone breakdown, like the pathophysiology that occurs with bone remodeling. There's something about those particular compounds that supports or like influences that. And because prunes are the food with the highest content in those, that's why they've been particularly chosen to investigate in this way.
Yeah. Okay. So we know about the women who participated, in which group they were put in, but remind me of their ages.
Right. So they were definitely postmenopausal. So
Yes.
the sort of in general kind of 55 to 75 was the span. Average age was around 60, if I remember correctly. But most importantly, again, to kind of keep things on the same page, is that most of the women were considered to be in late postmenopause, which means it had been at least 8 years since that last menstrual period, which can be important because it would mean that most of them are on the same page with the quantity of loss, which is often expected early in those postmenopausal years. There's a sort of greater trajectory of loss as estrogen has come down. And so that would have happened, and then they were looking at this sort of like stability of loss at that point. There were some women who were a little bit closer, but the bulk of the women were in that late postmenopausal phase.
Yeah, and they were generally considered healthy. They weren't on any medications that would affect bone, so like they weren't on HRT or bisphosphonates or anything that would sort of help with bone. But they were also in a range in terms of bone mineral density, that they went even from osteopenic to osteoporotic in that group as well. So in a lot of ways, a very average population that we would see, but they weren't like an ideal tip-top bone health either.
Right, which I think maybe is handy, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, right? Because those are, I mean, it would be also great to know that if people didn't have low bone density and they ate prunes, it would prevent loss. But ultimately, at least the people that I'm speaking with have been maybe recently told that their bone density is somewhat lowered. Maybe they're osteopenic and they're looking to prevent further loss. Or so those are the people who are going to be most motivated to try and find resources to prevent something from getting worse, right?
Yeah.
And it looks like the study's goal was to look at the whole range, right? Like people who had no reduced bone density, some reduced bone density, and then the osteoporotic type of level of bone density, but they weren't actually able to find that many women who unfortunately had like no loss, right? So the bulk of people in the study were definitely squarely in that osteopenic, osteoporotic categories. More in the osteopenic, but definitely more in that area.
Yeah.
I would say that although very commonly in my patient population, but not representative of the general population, most of the women were also Caucasian. And so when we look at applying this information to the people that we see in practice, it just means we have less confidence around the fact that this information might apply to everyone.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've got a good idea of what they were looking at, how it was set up, the women that were included. So we can probably jump to our findings at this point. So we've got the people who didn't eat prunes, the 50-gram prunes, and then the 100-gram prunes. We were looking at bone density. They looked at a lot of places, but for simplicity's sake, we'll just cut right to the chase of what was significant and different, because there was a lot of nuance in there in terms of, some areas of the body not gaining or staying the same. But what was the major finding of that primary outcome?
Yeah, so the major finding was that the total hip bone density in women who had 50 grams of prunes, and we'll come back to that in a second, statistically significantly different than our control. So normally what we might expect that to mean is that their bone density went up. So if you ate 50 grams of prunes, your bone density went up. Your controls who didn't have prunes, the bone density didn't improve. But in fact, in this study, and this is where this nuance can come in and how studies are read, the result is the same, which is the women who had 50 grams of prune were better off from a bone density perspective of the hip than the women who didn't have prunes. But it's because the prune eating women just saw their bone density stay the same. whereas the control women, the women who did not have the prunes, saw their bone density decrease by about 1.1% over the course of that 12-month period of time. And so that's a win, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily feel like a win on paper where you go, oh, well, their bone density didn't get any better. While that's true, everyone else has got worse. And so if you had prunes, you stayed the same versus your peers who didn't have prunes where it got worse.
Yeah.
So that's great. That's a sort of win. We have to start somewhere with our wins,
Yes.
and that is technically a win, right?
Totally.
Yeah. And maybe you can tell us as to why the focus on the results was around the 50-gram group of women. So, we very clearly stated there were 3 groups to start, nothing 50 gram, 100 gram. But the takeaway in the results, the main takeaway is that women who ate 50 grams of prunes maintained their total hip density, whereas our control population saw a 1.1% decrease in their total hip density after a year. What happened to our 100-gram peeps?
Yeah, so they had a hard time eating so many prunes, which, there was this time commitment issue. I don't know, maybe it just took them longer to eat these prunes, but that they really had digestive discomfort at that number of prunes. And so, I think this is hilarious. I think preferred jokes make me laugh forever and ever. But essentially, that many prunes is pretty tough on the gut, right? I don't know. They didn't really specify, but it could have been gas, loose stool, bloating, discomfort. As someone who sometimes can overdo it on the prunes, I will attest that 100 grams is a lot and you got to back down. So 50 feels way better from a digestive comfort standpoint. So yeah, their conclusion was this is helpful. We don't necessarily need to go that high. There's a compliance issue at that point where it is really hard to eat that many prunes daily. Can you think of that for a year? That's multiple handfuls of prunes. But that's something much more modest. Half that dose was effective in this regard. So yeah, the 100 grams. If you love prunes and your gut can tolerate them, I'm sure there's probably no harm at that point. But yeah, they're literally hard to stomach.
Yeah, it was not quite 50%, but I think it was just over 40% of the 100-gram participants dropped out. They just They couldn't do it, right? And what happens in studies that, although this is the biggest prune study of its kind, it's still a small study. There were only 235 people to start with. And when you have that divided into 3 groups, and then for one of the groups, almost 50% of people dropped out, when studies are designed, they rely on a certain number of people being in the study to make the statistics valid.
Yeah.
And so what happens in situations like this is, even if they get results from the other, let's say 60% or just under 60% of participants, the confidence that those results reflect reality goes away.
Yeah.
So they can look at certain parts of the data, but they can't really say what we learned from the rest of the people who took 100 grams. We can't hold that to the same weight, or it doesn't have the same weight as our statements around the comparison between the 50 and the 0. So they did allude to it at different times, and they kind of did some fancy footwork at different times, all the while still saying we can't really rely on this because we didn't have enough people. So like Antonella said, we just cut to the chase, and we've just disregarded that piece and said, really the takeaway here is that if you do 50 grams, or at least in this study, the people who did 50 grams were more likely to maintain that total hip bone density over the course of a year than the people who didn't. And again, 50 grams was much better tolerated. In fact, there was no difference in sort of tolerability between our control group and the 50-gram prune group.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll talk about, we want to end with sort of how this would fit in clinically, or sort of how we apply it, right? Because it's living within an ecosystem of other tools. But before that, I think criticism is actually a strong word. It's maybe more an observation or a topic of discussion, is that this study technically was industry funded. So it was funded by the Prune board. They provided the prunes. It explicitly states that they didn't have any say in the design of the study or the funding of the study. But we did find it an interesting example because there can be a lot of criticism in the scientific space around industry-sponsored studies and their findings and what we do with them. And that the Prune board feels a little bit more neutral than maybe other boards like the meat or dairy board or a pharmaceutical board that we might have a lot stronger feelings around. But in essence, it's not different, right? It's industry sponsoring the science. And if like there's questions that we would maybe apply or things to think through to see, do we trust this data? Do we not trust this data? But we just wanted to like have full transparency around that. But I think it's an interesting point of discussion. Where do you start to answer that, Alex? Or how does it make you think about the study differently or at all?
Yeah, it's always tricky, right? Because you're right. Our inherent biases, they happen so unconsciously. We were even joking. It's like, well, even if they did sponsor it, it's not like there's a risk of these study results leading to like big Prune making a
Yeah.
ton of money around the world now, right? But the fact is, it shouldn't be considered any different because they are funding something, presumably with the hope that the results are positive and
Hmm.
that in fact it will translate to some sort of financial recompense down the road because people will have more, right?
Yeah.
So that their goal may not be directly to influence anything, hopefully, but their hope, I'm sure, is that the test results, the study results are positive and that over time translates to greater enthusiasm for prune ingestion across the world by at least postmenopausal people.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think what it comes down to is that also recognizing that running research is really expensive. Like
Hmm.
someone's paying for it, right?
Yeah.
And it's no joke trying to find the funding for research of any kind, even small studies. Like there's so many nuts and bolts and moving parts. Like it takes a lot of money. And so if someone is funding it, that doesn't inherently make it a bad study. But one of the reasons we're doing this and we enjoy working through studies is looking at what happens in the method section and how do they describe how certain things are done. Because you can make a statement that, well, they just gave the prunes and some funding, but they weren't involved in anything. And we have to take that at face value. But certainly sometimes you can kind of read between the lines in terms of how certain things were
Hmm.
done that make you think maybe there was a little bit more hands-on than they're suggesting, right? And we've come across different studies in the past, especially not especially, sometimes in like the supplement realm where it's like some of the researchers are also employed by the supplement company, right? And so
Yeah.
they can make a statement that the company just supplied the supplements for the participants and that there was some funding. But if also they employed the researchers, you start to become a little bit more suspicious around the the lack of bias, right? So
Yeah.
it
That
doesn't
the
mean people
waters
are
get muddied.
yeah.
Hmm.
It's not that people are maliciously misrepresenting necessarily, but that we are human beings and bias runs a lot of our lives. So yeah, I think it goes back to the importance of not using the abstract of a study to inform your decision
Hmm.
making.
Yeah.
And working your way through. If you're going to be using information to make changes in your life in relation to your health, or as healthcare providers that we're using this information to inform the recommendations that we make, we can't just take the information from an abstract and be like, oh, they said this, without going into a little bit, digging deeper and making sure
Yes.
we feel confident about that.
Yeah, because the other plus side is like as a dovetail into the discussion of where this fits in is that like we're also seeing something that feels a little bit random, right? Like who knew, right? That
Prunes.
prunes could have this interesting concentration of ingredients that have a benefit on something that is, really highly detrimental to quality of life down the line, right? Like osteoporosis, we still don't have fracture data. So just to underline, right? We don't know that this prevents fractures. But as a proxy there, if bone mineral density isn't deteriorating at that same rate or at that, at that 1.1%, there could be benefit there. And, a small study that's expensive, we wouldn't have had that data maybe otherwise just by like the goodwill of the science community and having to fund and
Right.
grant and all of that. And so in this population, I think where bisphosphonates have a very high side effect profile and sometimes don't fit within the value system or women really that like they're intolerable to them, it adds something else to the discussion, which is actually valuable, I think, as well. But yeah, we were talking a little bit like, how does this start to fit in clinically? Like, how do we apply this? Because this study, right, the women weren't medicated. We saw the prunes, but in instances, we might use it maybe differently or in different use cases. Yeah. So what do you think about like the clinical significance of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think so that because this is not the first of its kind in terms of its study, like this is actually something I've discussed with patients for a number of years and always tried to do right by the context of it all, right?
Yes.
So when I'm talking about bone density with people and we're discussing the greater context, it would never be like just have prunes and everything is going to be okay. Right. So, from a lifestyle perspective, especially if someone chooses or can't tolerate medication, whatever that looks like, that is part of a much larger picture, not just of all lifestyle factors, most importantly, movement and certain types of activity, but even just the nutritional context. There's lots of other things to talk about than prunes in nutrition and bone health. So, if I think about some of my resources and so on, like prunes is on the list in the polyphenol category, and we have a little bit more of an in-depth conversation in like 50 grams and so on. But it's part of a much larger whole, much of which is taken up by the activity evidence, right?
Yeah.
Because that's so profound. If we're talking about the medication, I'm always really clear at saying these are not equivalencies, right? Like we not only do we not have the data, like any sort of head-to-head data, I can't imagine anyone funding that Prune board or not, like prunes versus bisphosphonates. But if we look at the numbers so far, right, to say, okay, well, the total hip went down by 1.1% in the control group. Well, if that group had been on bisphosphonates, like from other study reports, we're seeing an increase in bone density by 3 to 5%, right?
Yeah.
And so we always have to put that in context so people don't feel they're like, well, I was going to take bisphosphonates, but I'm doing
now
prunes
just need prunes.
instead,
Yeah.
right? But there are people who are never going to do the bisphosphonates. And so this is an opportunity as part of that larger context to support bone health in a way, like you said, that may meet someone's goals and approaches. And there was something else I was going to add there. Darn it all.
We could, you had said during the drug holidays. I don't know if that was where your mind was going, but maybe.
Yes. No, go ahead. Please. That is exactly what I wanted to
So I'll steal Alex's point and you can correct me. But that a lot of times with bisphosphonates, doctors will recommend a drug holiday. So a period of time of not being on the medication. And so during that time, right, like things are just going to start to decrease, that this might be a use for the prunes that like maybe they'll be able to maintain or prevent further loss during that drug holiday. And so that might be another use for them. And I had also thought about it, right? Like, I think then we can borrow or sort of extrapolate, like from a prevention standpoint, even though the study isn't prevention, but if we sort of want to layer on things that we know to be good for bone, I don't think it's going to be harmful if someone's worried about osteoporosis or has a family history and they're doing weight training and calcium and eating a whole foods, colorful diet and like lifting those heavy weights, also adding in the prunes is just like a little extra insurance. I personally think that would be a delicious recommendation and good for your digestive tract, hopefully as well.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about, a dessert alternative. And I think sometimes, especially in the naturopathic field, we're given a side eye when we're like, just have fruit instead of,
ice cream.
Instead of ice cream, right? But, like there are ways to consider these things, right? Like a prune, a chocolate dipped prune might be lovely, right? If you didn't just enjoy prunes for themselves. And so I think that conversation can be quite fun to have in terms of like, well, what kind of things could we double down on, right? So if someone is trying to reduce their simple carbohydrates and also improve their bone density, could we be looking at introducing prunes, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes people will be like, oh, well, they're so high calorie and so on and so forth. And especially when you're making swapperoos, that question becomes actually often unimportant, really. Like if you're doing this instead of this, that's not even a point of conversation. And in fact, this study, which we didn't talk about, did consider that and looked at changes in weight over time. And the conclusion was that there was no difference between the groups. And what that actually meant when they looked at the numbers was that every group gained weight and no group gained more weight than the other. And so the conversation was, well, for whatever reason, whether that was aging or just the nature of whatever. But the fact is the group that ate prunes didn't see a greater weight gain.
Yeah.
And the caloric amount of, I'm totally going askew here, but
That's okay.
the caloric load of 4 to 5 prunes, like 50 grams of prunes, is only about 100, 110 calories, right? So it, especially if you're replacing something else with it, like that's
Yeah. And they're
that's
low
like,
in saturated fat. They have fiber,
yeah,
right? And they're full of those phytochemicals. Because I also think, in a certain way, like that speaks to people's reservations around like fruits and things that are sweet. It feels like, oh, I shouldn't have those either,
yeah,
or
it must be bad
it must be
somehow.
bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I do think they're a great dessert alternative, dipped in chocolate, right? And like pretty, like really accessible, right? Like they're options, and this just like growing evidence and interesting science from the polyphenol content and how that's just modulatory and anti-inflammatory, I think is fascinating. Yeah. All right. So any final thoughts, or does that bring us to the end of this dried plum study?
No, I mean, I always have further thoughts, but I think that really covers the bases that we were interested in sharing.
Yeah. All right. It was
Yeah.
so good to see you, Alex, and we'll look
You too,
forward to
Antonella.
chatting the next time.
Sounds great. Okay. Bye.
Bye.